Hello! I want to introduce you to a matter that has gained much attention lately. More specifically, Google's action within the ad tech industry and its acquisition of DoubleClick in 2007. Antitrust enforcers in the EU and the US reviewed the transaction, but neither expressed concerns, eventually clearing it unconditionally. As I shall explain, Google's ad tech business has gained much antitrust interest globally, begging whether enforcers made the right call when choosing not to oppose Google's acquisition of DoubleClick. I will reference the relevant parts of the EU's decision in my presentation, allowing you to consult them directly. I will not offer comments on the review undertaken by US enforcers. Unlike lawyers and governmental representatives, I don't need to declare that I speak in a personal capacity. Instead, I must declare that I think I know what I'm talking about. But things tend to become challenging when it comes to Google's alleged misdeeds. Not only is the underlying tech complex, but Google keeps changing the name of its services and blending in new ones. So if you feel I have misunderstood something, please reach out. Google acquired DoubleClick in 2007 after a bidding war in which Google agreed to pay $3.1 billion. I understand that other contenders were Microsoft and Yahoo. Please keep this in mind when we return to the counterfactual scenarios. EU cleared the transaction unconditionally in 2008. The transaction was also cleared unconditionally in the US, but, as already explained, I will not detail the US decision. Across jurisdictions, criticism has been raised about the wisdom of clearing the transaction unconditionally. An example of this can be found with Open Market Institute, which refers to the Google DoubleClick merger in a recent letter. I agree with many of the concerns expressed in the letter, but not how all subsequent issues originated in the Google DoubleClick merger and the failure to block this. You might ask yourself the relevance of discussing a transaction that took place years ago, and I understand your question. However, please be mindful that whenever Google comes up in an antitrust discussion, most instantly assume something anti-competitive. This also applies to Google DoubleClick, and I will try not to disappoint you. DoubleClick offers services that we would call ad tech today. As you can see from my overview here, there are several ongoing antitrust investigations about ad tech and Google. In the US, there are two, and in particular, the DOJ case has attracted much attention, and references have been made to the Google DoubleClick merger here. Outside the US, I'm tracking ad tech investigations in several jurisdictions, and I have identified over 160 antitrust cases involving Google globally so far. Not regarding ad tech, but Google generally. Before we move on, we need to know a little about online advertising. Online ads can roughly be segmented into searchable and non-searchable ads. Examples of searchable ads can be seen on the left. These ads appear on search pages blended in with the organic blue links. Searchable ads are Google's traditional revenue streams. Examples of non-searchable ads can be seen on the rights. These can be found on domain addresses or content pages like YouTube and Facebook. Non-searchable ads are also called display ads and account for an increasing portion of Google's business revenue. Ad tech services connect advertisers with the owner of domains, called publishers, through an intermediator that might rely on auctions over an exchange. In this model, you can see the advertisers on the left and the publishers on the right. Google offerings are highlighted in light green. The model pertains to non-searchable ads. As explained earlier, we often refer to these as display ads. It should also be noted that the model is one I have located online, relying on Google. This might not be the most prudent way of locating information on Google's alleged crime spree, but it's my only option. The intermediator, which often would be Google, offers several partly overlapping and complementary services when an advertiser wants to contract with publishers to run a campaign. Traditionally, this would be done manually and based on meetings and discussions, as illustrated by epic TV series such as Mad Men. The publishers would be newspapers and the owners of public billboards, but the proliferation of online advertising has fundamentally changed this industry, including how to buy and sell advertising. Not only have newspapers and billboards been replaced by online options, but the whole process has been automated, where advertisers' and publishers' bids are cleared over an exchange akin to a traditional marketplace or stock exchange. How this is done depends on many factors, including whether you are a large or small advertiser, but as you can see from the model, it often involves relying on a Google offering. As explained later, this creates a potential conflict of interest. DoubleClick was and is an intermediator, but its activities originally had a more limited and target focus. After acquiring DoubleClick, Google changed its functionalities, and I understand how DoubleClick today serves publishers and advertisers more broadly. Therefore, the model doesn't represent how DoubleClick worked in 2007, but as already indicated, I have not found anything better. The model illustrates that the intermediator offers several services within the larger ecosystem. However, a distinction can be made between matching advertisers and publishers to buy and sell advertising space and the subsequent placement of the advertising. Intermediators, therefore, often bundle their services, managing both the sales process and the subsequent placement of the advertising. As explained later, DoubleClick's activities were confined to managing the subsequent placement of advertising space once acquired. DoubleClick was not really involved in buying and selling advertising space back in 2007. Google, in contrast, offered both as a bundle. This explains why EU did not identify Google and DoubleClick as direct competitors during the review. As already indicated, Google serves both advertisers and publishers. As the owner of YouTube, Google is probably also one of the most significant publishers, and Google even owns the most prominent exchange, where bids are cleared. This creates a potential conflict of interest where Google could take advantage of its position to prefer its own services to the detriment of competitors and customers. The latter would be the advertisers and publishers. If pursuing a foreclosure strategy, the victims could also include competing exchanges. The French Competition Authority concluded in 2021 that Google had favored its own exchange at the expense of publishers and advertisers. Several other enforcers have followed suits and opened investigations, but only the French have been concluded as of speaking. There are probably variations in the investigations across the jurisdictions, but at the core, they are directed at the embedded conflict of interest associated with serving several parties with conflicting interests. With the benefit of hindsight, it's tempting to conclude that EU made a mistake when clearing Google's acquisition of DoubleClick unconditionally in 2008. However, this is only with the benefit of hindsight, and I'm not even convinced it's correct. Google acquired DoubleClick in 2007 for $3.1 billion. Unlike other tech acquisitions, it appears to have gone relatively unnoticed in 2007. I have not been able to find any original critics, but perhaps I'm not looking in the right places. It might also be unwise to rely on Google when searching on the internet for stories about Google's alleged misdeeds. But what are the alternatives? I did manage to locate an article by Jacques Cremet, but it's not very detailed. Other voices mainly focused on privacy issues. Hal Singer rebutted that Google and DoubleClick did not compete. As outlined later, this was a core assumption in EU review and justification for clearing the transaction. When reviewing the unconditional clearance, we must understand how online marketing in 2007 was still very nascent, accounting for less than 6% of total global advertising in 2006. It had excellent growth potential, and Google probably understood this significantly earlier than others, probably ahead of traditional advertisers. As you can see from the figure, online marketing is growing and outgrowing traditional offline advertising. EU estimated the total market size for online marketing to be €8 billion in 2006, with searchable online advertising slightly larger and non-searchable. This has changed as we advanced, and non-searchable advertising is much larger today than searchable. We can even see how traditional channels have stagnated. EU defined an overall online advertising market separate from offline marketing in its decision. EU contemplated further segmentation, but refuted its relevance, as it did not influence the transaction assessment. In contrast, it was relevant to identify separate markets for buying and selling space and the subsequent managing of this, where the latter included placing the ads. It was, therefore, relevant to segment between intermediation services and ad-serving services, where the former covered the sales process and the latter the actual placement of the advertising. As indicated earlier, many intermediates offered both as a bundle, but separate services could be identified. DoubleClick activities were confined to managing the subsequent placement of advertising space once it was acquired, in contrast to Google's. However, Google appeared more focused on selling advertising space, primarily offering managing as an ancillary service. For linguistic reasons, the market for online advertising space was national, while the others were EEA-wide. The transaction, therefore, involved 3 product markets, where only the online space market had a national scope. I have tried to compare these markets to one involved in the French ad tech case and EU's decision in Google AdSense. They cannot be transferred directly, but I recognize elements, including many offered considerations, indicating that EU got the market definitions rights in 2008. In AdSense, EU segmented between searchable and non-searchable advertising and between relying on intermediator and direct sales. I think this reflects how the market and the services have matured since 2008. Collecting reliable marked data proved challenging in 2008, but Google was identified as the leading provider of online advertising in EEA. Google was, in particular, strong in searchable online advertising and had a minimal stake in non-searchable advertising. This indicates how nascent display advertising was in 2008. Both Google and DoubleClick had very high market shares, but these did not account for direct sales nor internal captive sales, indicating them as inflated. Google and DoubleClick had specialized their operations and were not identified as direct competitors. EU considered whether DoubleClick's unbundled services potentially restrained Google's bundled offerings. EU also considered whether Google would mature nascent services following the acquisition or abstain from this. The transaction presented 3 potential horizontal concerns, but none of them was considered plausible by EU. Google and DoubleClick were not close substitutes, and for different reasons, it was implausible that the parties had an interest or ability to mature the services that might overlap. With the benefit of hindsight, I think EU underestimated Google's strength and ability to identify long-term trends, but this is easy to conclude many years later. EU also evaluated if the transaction could create non-horizontal concerns, either because it would allow Google to foreclose vertical markets or gain portfolio power, but EU rejected this, usually due to a lack of ability and incentive to pursue a foreclosure strategy. EU cleared the transaction unconditionally, yielding neither horizontal nor non-horizontal concerns. The parties operated in 2 separate parts of the ad tech sector, with only limited and indirect overlaps. With the benefit of hindsight, the transaction might have vested Google portfolio power, but this remains somewhat speculative. As explained earlier, DoubleClick is only a minor element in Google's larger ad tech ecosystem. We must also consider the counterfactual scenario and how the market would have developed if Google had not acquired DoubleClick. We even need to be mindful of how the courts had kneecapped EU's approach to portfolio leveraging in Tetralaval a few years before. Obviously, we don't know how things would have developed had Google not acquired DoubleClick or if EU had blocked the transaction. However, it does not seem plausible that DoubleClick would have remained independent. The seller was a financial investor who had acquired DoubleClick when DoubleClick struggled financially, intending to do a turnaround and eventually sell it for a profit. Not selling DoubleClick was, therefore, not an option. It should also be noted how Google outbid the other bidders. I understand these to have involved Microsoft and Yahoo, making it plausible that DoubleClick would have ended up with somebody who also would have integrated DoubleClick into a larger ecosystem. I'm not even convinced Google would have escaped becoming the target of so many antitrust investigations. The bulk of these have involved activities and interests other than ad tech, and it was not until around 2020 that enforcers started to investigate this segment. EU did touch upon searchable online advertising in Google AdSense in 2019, but not display ads and not to the same level as later. The counterfactual scenario would, therefore, be the same as what we have just gone through. So, returning to my initial question, did EU make the right call when clearing Google's acquisition of DoubleClick? I think EU was right in clearing the transaction. Google's ability to exercise market power does not originate with DoubleClick. With the benefit of hindsight, the risk of portfolio power might have been underestimated. Google has effectively integrated DoubleClick into a more extensive advertising ecosystem, leveraging market power between offerings. In EU's defense, this understanding mostly follows from what happened later, including how Google developed its ecosystem. It should also be recalled how the Court of Justice overturned EU's attempt to rein in portfolio power in the early 2000s, making it understandable why EU might have had a limited appetite for a rematch. Not until recently have we started to fully understand the anti-competitive side of ecosystem leveraging and portfolio power. Granted, some people identified the risk early on, but personally, I was late to this understanding. I promised initially to provide you with a complete reference to EU's decision. You can see it at the left. Concerning EU's new investigation into ad tech, I have tried to make an educated guess in this article that I would recommend. As outlined initially, this is my attempt to decode a highly complex case that might be the source of current antitrust issues. In this, I have tried to outline the services involved. Feel free to reach out if you have comments or feel I have misunderstood elements.